Alright, so what I'm about to say may stir up some shit, but I want a preference before we go any further. I love 40k as much as I love Warhammer Fantasy. That's, before we go any further into this video, and keep in mind, this is just an opinion. This is just an opinion in one way or another. And if you want to even call it that, this is just like a topic video. At the end of the day, it's just a video to gauge where you guys all stand on this. Because I've heard, this was interesting enough to me because I thought, I've heard so much back and forth, I thought I'd throw my own hat in the ring on this. Before we go any further, I love 40k equally as much as Warhammer Fantasy. So let's talk about it, as you can see from the title. Is Warhammer Fantasy better than 40k? Now, obviously a few things. The big thing is Warhammer Fantasy came first. And it also went away for a good decade. I think it was either 5-10 years before they brought it back as the Age of Sigmar. But yeah, Warhammer Fantasy came first. And then 40k. I think a lot of people forget that that Fantasy came before 40k because a lot of us, myself included, showed up because of Warhammer 40k because Space Marine looks cool. I mean, don't feel bad. Everyone who I've talked about, why they got into 40k was, oh, the Space Marine looked cool. That's 80% to 90% of everyone's answer. Don't feel bad. That's a vast majority. But then, as I learned more and more about 40k, I learned more about Fantasy and, by extension, Age of Sigmar. And I kind of had this interesting thought. Is Fantasy better than 40k? That's the question we're going to be asking right now. Now, a couple things. I really do think that thematically and story-wise, I think Fantasy has the edge. Let me explain. You see, in Warhammer 40k, there's a lot of things that they don't like to talk about, like the War in Heaven, or there's other wars that happened, and maybe we'll get stories and books and codexes about those wars at some point or another. At some point, we may get those stories, but they're kind of left ambiguous, and there's no and there's also these lingering plot threads everywhere, even in the books and codexes in 40k, where nothing is really resolved, and it's just kind of kept status quo forever. Whereas in Warhammer Fantasy, you clearly see change every so often. There's a major event and things shift. Not to say things don't shift in Warhammer 40k. But it's much slower. It is so much slower for any kind of story progression in 40k than it is in Fantasy. In Fantasy, it really does feel like every so often, even at a faster pace, the storylines really it doesn't feel like it's grinding to a halt. It feels like it's always moving every few months or so. Whereas 40k, the only thing that has been a major change is bringing there's been a few other things, like the official end to the Horus Heresy novels, and of course Lion returning to the main storyline, but we haven't really gotten further than that as of this recording. And again, that can change, that can be a lot of things. But on the other end, you have Age of Sigmar, which is just blasting forward. It is, and again, it has a lot of I will give it the benefit of the doubt that it is it's trying to play catch up, and I've seen a lot of people do that, say that, and I do agree that there is some serious catching up to do with it. There is some catching up to do with 40k, but at the same time, the story progression has been more constant, and if it really does feel like there's character development and things there, even though yes, Age of Sigmar is still on the rebuild from Warhammer the Old World. Age of Sigmar is still building its universe again because the world blew up, so they have to rebuild the mythos, and again, it's all about playing catch up and everything. Now, a couple other things is the universe of Fantasy has an edge, a few other edges on 40k. Now, keep in mind, 40k does have the grim dark fantasy of the far universe, the grim dark universe of the future, and that's the whole theme it's supposed to be. And sometimes it does, like, we can all agree that sometimes the grim darkness does get a little ridiculous. It does get so grim dark it's ridiculous. And on the other end, fantasy has that grim dark too, but there's like hope there. There's like, it's not just, you know, ooh, xenophobia, you know, if you're not human you get burned, or, you know, we kill all them. And to be fair, there is an inquisition in fucking fantasy, but it's not to like the insane level that the 40K is. But fantasy has like this thing of, we're not raging at, you know, we're not an empire raging at the dying of the light. It's a empire fighting for the Empire of Man. Like, I would say the Empire of Man is a lot more forward thinking than the Imperium of Man, because the Empire of Man, even though it's like it's literally the Renaissance era, and it does have Renaissance era technology, it's an empire that's on the rise. It's not, and that's the other thing I like about fantasy, is that the Empire of Man, it isn't like your typical fantasy setting where it's like, oh, we're in medieval times, we stop now for a couple hundred years. No, that, if you want that, you get Britannia, for better or for worse for some people. But for the Empire of Man, you like, there is some xenophobia, but not to the level of like the Imperium of Man. And the Empire of Man's like, oh cool, high dwarf, or sometimes they'll be cool with elves or their neighbors, unless they're vampires. That's a different story. And again, it's clear that it's not the Empire raging against everybody in a dying empire. No, it's an empire that, while it does have its problems, it does have a strong form of leadership, and it knows who its enemies are and it knows who its friends are. The Warhammer fantasy world is like, chaos bad, orcs bad, dark elves bad, lizard men, tomb kings, they can be bad sometimes. But it's not like we're fighting everybody. Like, we're fighting everybody who isn't human. And also, what I think I also like, and I'll bring it up, is that humans are the main focus. It's not like a bunch of like super strong god warriors, although that did change with the inclusion of the Stormcast Eternals. But what I like a little more over whereas in 40K the Space Marines get all the cool shit. Like, it's just Space Marine and Chaos Space Marine stuff all the time. Don't get it twisted, I still like Space Marines, but even I have to admit that, like, it does, like, Space Marines and Primarchs do overshadow the rest of the universe. I speak as, like, a fan of Necron, like, the Necrons, and I feel like they've been getting shafted for a while. Really, the only thing they've had is the Twice Dead King and Infinite and Divine. Both, like, all three great books, but that's it. Like, that's really all they've had. And it's not just taking away from them, it's taking away from the Eldar, it's taking away from the other races, and it really does feel like we're just kind of gearing up for the Horus Heresy Part 2 in some capacity. Whereas over on the fantasy side, yes, the Stormcast Eternals are just, you know, medieval Space Marines. You still have characters who are not Stormcast, human characters, elves, dwarves. They all get these spots in this time in the sun to shine and grow as characters. Do I hope they keep that with fantasy and not make it the Stormcast Eternal show? I hope. Again, everything can change in a couple of years. I could do a video talking about, like, how things have misbalanced between fantasy and now 40K's doing all the stuff fantasy's doing right now. But again, I love the, everybody all hail to the God Emperor, but at the same time, I'm like, Karl Franz is just a better Emperor in Warhammer. I think we can all agree that Karl Franz is, like, the best Emperor in any Warhammer setting, right? That's not heresy. Like, I've seen so many people be like, oh yeah, Karl Franz, like, is a way better Emperor than the God. Not power-wise, we're not power scaling here, but, like, Emperor to their people, Karl Franz takes it. Anyway, but yeah, so that's just kind of like, again, I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say about this one. So I'm going to leave it off to you. Do you guys think fantasy is better than 40K, or do you think the other way around? I'm just curious. I just think that fantasy does some things better than 40K does. Like, you know, not overexposing one faction. It actually gives love to all the factions. Even though I would like to have the Tomb Kings back for Age of Sigmar. Oh wait, did they come back? God, I am so tired. I need to get more sleep. Besides, I'm a Skaven guy, and the Skaven are the main focus of this whole new event, so I'm happy. Anyway, so yeah, you guys just comment below, let me know. Other than that, hope you all enjoyed this. I'm Mr. Multiverse. I'll see you next time in the Multiverse.